541 various continental monarchies. The Peace of Utrecht, it will be recalled, had registered the defeat of French ambitions in the wars of Louis XIV. The French move toward universal monarchy had been blocked. The European state system had been preserved. Europe was to consist of independent and sovereign states, all legally free and equal, continuously entering or leaving alliances along the principles of the balance of power. The peace settlement of 1713 to 1714 placed the Bourbon Philip V on the Spanish throne, but gave most of Spain's European possessions, outside Spain itself, to the Austrian Habsburgs. See maps, pp. 199, 336. Great Britain, which had been consolidated during the wars as a combined kingdom of England and Scotland, took Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, and the Hudson Bay region from France and, taking Gibraltar and Minorca from Spain, became a naval power in the Mediterranean. The British also received trading rights in Spanish America, thus expanding their role in the Atlantic slave trade and enhancing their position as the most dynamic power in the rapidly developing transatlantic economic system. Governments now turned to repairing the damages of war. Spain was somewhat rejuvenated by the French influence under its new Bourbon monarchy. The drift and decadence that had set in under the last Habsburgs were at least halted. The Spanish state was administratively strengthened. Its officials followed the absolutist government of Louis XIV as a model. The estates of the East Spanish kingdoms, Aragon and Valencia, ceased to meet, going like the Estates General of France into the limbo of obsolete institutions. On the whole, the French influence in 18th century Spain was intangible. Nothing was changed in substance, but the old machinery functioned with more precision. Administrators were better trained and took a more constructive attitude toward government work. They became more aware of the world north of the Pyrenees and recovered confidence in their country's future. They tried also to tighten up the administration of their American empire. More revenue officers and coast guards were introduced in the Caribbean, whose zeal led to repeated clashes with smugglers, mainly British. Friction along the Spanish-controlled coasts of the 542 American mainland, reinforced by Spanish dislike for British occupation of Gibraltar, kept Spain and Britain in a continual ferment of potential hostility. Repairing the damages of war. The Dutch, after Utrecht, receded from the international political stage, though their alliance was always sought because of the huge shipping and financial resources they controlled. The Swiss also became important in banking and financial circles. A new commercial group in the Austrian Netherlands, the region that would later become Belgium, founded an overseas trading company in 1723 on the authority of their new Austrian ruler. This Ostend Company sent out 6 highly profitable voyages to China, but the commercial jealousy of the Dutch and British obliged the Austrian emperor to withdraw his support as a price for British recognition of his daughter's right to inherit the Austrian throne. The Ostend enterprise thus came to an end. The Scots began at about this time to play their remarkable role of energizing business affairs in many countries. Union with England in 1707 gave them access to the British Empire and to the numerous commercial advantages won by the English. John Law, the financial wizard of France, was a Scot, as was William Paterson, one of the chief founders of the Bank of England. 543, France and Britain aware 1713. Our main attention falls on France and Britain. Though one was the victor and the other the vanquished in the wars that ended in 1713, and though one stood for royal absolutism and the other for parliamentary constitutionalism in government, their development in the years after Utrecht was in some ways surprisingly parallel. In both countries, for some years, the king was personally ineffective, and in both the various propertied interests therefore gained many advantages. Both pursued the commercial and colonial expansion described above. Both went through a short period of financial experimentation and frantic speculation in stocks, the financial bubble bursting in each case in 1720. Each was thereafter governed by a statesman, Cardinal Fleury in France and Robert Walpole in England, whose policy was to keep peace abroad and conciliate all interests at home. Fleury and Walpole held office for about 2 decades, toward the end of which the two countries again went to war. but the differences are at least as instructive as the parallels. In France, the new king was a child, Louis XIV, the great-grandson of Louis XIV, and only 5 years old when his reign began in 1715. The government was entrusted to a regent, the Duke of Orleans, an elder cousin of the young king. Orleans, lacking the authority of a monarch, had to admit the aristocracy to a greater share of the power that nobles had lost during the long reign of Louis XIV. Most of the nobles had never liked the absolutist policies of Louis XIV, and there was much dissatisfaction with absolutism among all classes because of the ruin and suffering brought by Louis XIV's wars. The 18th century for France was a period in which absolutism was checked and balanced by organized privileged groups. Nobles won back many of the powers that Louis XIV had taken from them in the previous century, thereby achieving a kind of aristocratic resurgence. The higher nobles, ousted by Louis XIV, now reappeared in the government. For a time, Orleans worked through committees of noblemen, roughly corresponding to ministries, a system lauded by its backers as a revival of political freedom. But the committees proved so incompetent that they were soon abandoned. The old parliaments of France, and especially the Parliament of Paris, which Louis XIV had reduced to silence, vigorously reasserted themselves after his death. The parliaments were primarily law courts, originally composed of bourgeois judges. But Louis XIV and his predecessors, to raise money, had made the 293 and 544 judgeships into offices to be sold, and they attached titles of nobility to increase the price. Hence, in the time of the Regency, the judges of the parliaments had bought or inherited their seats and were almost all nobles. Because they owned their offices as a kind of private property, they could not be removed by the king. The regent conceded much influence to the Parliament of Paris, utilizing it to modify the will of Louis XIV. The parliaments thus broadened their position, claiming the right to assent to legislation and taxes, through refusing to enforce government measures that they considered contrary to the unwritten constitution or fundamental laws of France. They managed to exercise this right off and on from the days of the Regency until the Great Revolution of 1789. French aristocratic resurgence. In Great Britain, the Parliament was very different from the French parliaments, and the British aristocracy was more politically competent than the noblesse of France. Parliament proved an effective machine for the conduct of public business. The House of Lords was hereditary, with the large exception of the bishops, who were appointed by the government and made up about a quarter of the active members of the upper house. The House of Commons was not at all representative of the country, according to modern ideas. Only the wealthy, or those patronized by the wealthy, could sit in it, and they were chosen by diverse and eccentric methods, in counties and towns, almost without regard to the size or wishes of the population. Some boroughs were owned outright, like the old Sarum of the Pitt family. But through the machinations of bosses or purchase of seats, all kinds of interests managed to get representatives into the Commons. Some members spoke for the landed interest, others for the funded interest, mainly government creditors, others for the London interest, the West India interest, the East India interest, and others. All of the leading economic groups and politically significant social classes could expect to have influence in Parliament, and all therefore were willing to go through parliamentary channels. Parliament was corrupt, slow, and expensive, but it was effective. For Parliament was not only a roughly representative body, it had also acquired, in practice, the power to legislate. The English Parliament, 545 Queen Anne, the last reigning Stuart, died in 1714. She was succeeded by George I, Elector of Hanover, as Parliament had previously arranged in the Act of Settlement of 1701. George Thurst was the nearest relative of the Stuarts, who was also a Protestant. A middle-aged German who spoke no English, he continued to spend much of his time in Germany, and he brought with him to England a retinue of German ministers and mistresses. He was never popular in England, where he was regarded as at best a political convenience. He was in no position to play a strong hand in English public life, and during his reign, Parliament gained considerable independence from the Crown. The main problem was still whether the principles of the Revolution of 1688 should be maintained. The Whigs, who considered the revolution as their work, long remained a minority made up of a few great landowning noblemen, wealthy London merchants, lesser business people, and nonconformists in religion. The Whigs generally controlled the House of Lords, but the House of Commons was more uncertain. At the time of the Peace of Utrecht, its majority was Tory. After 1714, the two parties tended to dissolve, and the terms Whig and Tory ceased to have much definite meaning. In general, the government and the Anglican bishops who were close to the government remained Whig. Men who were remote from the central government, or suspicious of its activities, formed a kind of country party quite different from the earlier Tories. Gentry and yeomen of the shires and byways were easily mobilized against the great noblemen and men of money who led the Whigs. In the established church, the lesser clergy were sometimes critical of the Whig bishops. In Scotland also, the ancestral home of the Stuarts, many were disaffected with the new regime. British Whigs and Tories 294. Tories and Scots made up a milieu after 1688, in which what would now be called counter-revolution might develop. Never enthusiastic for the Whig wars against France, critical of the mounting national debt that 546 the wars created, distrustful of the business and moneyed interests, they began to look wistfully to the exiled Stuarts. After 1701, when James died in France, the Stuart claims devolved upon his son, who lived until 1766, scheming time and again to make himself King of England. His partisans were known as Jacobites, from Jacobus, the Latin for James. They claimed that he had a divine right to the monarchy and regarded him as James the Third, whereas others called him the Pretender. The Jacobites felt that if he would give up his Catholic religion, he should be accepted as Britain's rightful king. The Whigs could not tolerate a return of the Stuarts. The restoration of James III and his divine right partisans would undo the principles of the Glorious Revolution: limited monarchy, constitutionalism, parliamentary supremacy, the rule of law, the toleration of dissenting Protestants. In short, all that was summarized and defended in the political writings of John Locke. Moreover, those who held stock in the Bank of England or who had lent their money to the government would be ruined, because James III would surely repudiate a debt contracted by his foes. The Whigs were bound to support the Hanoverian George I. And George, I was bound to look for support in a strange country among the Whigs. James III, 547. George lacked personal appeal even for his English friends. To his enemies, he was ridiculous and repulsive. The successful establishment of his dynasty would ruin the hopes of Tories and Jacobites. In 1715, the Pretender landed in Scotland, gathered followers from the Highlands, and proclaimed a rebellion against George I. Civil war seemed to threaten. But the Jacobite leaders bungled, and many of their followers proved to be undecided. They were willing enough to toast the king over the water in protest against the Whigs, but not willing in a showdown to see the Stuarts, and all that went with them, again in possession of the crown of England. The 15, as the revolt came to be called, petered out, but 30 years later came the 45. In 1745, during war with France, the Pretender's son, Bonnie Prince Charlie, or the Young Pretender, again landed in Scotland and again proclaimed rebellion. This time, though almost no one in England rallied, the uprising was more successful. A Scottish force penetrated to within 80 miles of London and was driven back and crushed with the help of Hanoverian regiments rushed over from Germany. The British government set out to destroy Jacobitism in the Scottish Highlands. The social system of the Highlands was wiped out, the clans were broken up, and their lands were forcibly reorganized according to modern notions of property and of landlord and tenant. Threats of Civil War 295 had been able to maximize their resources through banking and credit, and even to finance the alliance that had eclipsed the Sun King. In addition, there was much private demand for both lending and borrowing money. Private persons all over Western Europe were looking for 548. The Jacobite uprisings confirmed the old reputation of England in the eyes of Europe, namely, as Voltaire said, that its government was as stormy as the seas that surrounded it. To partisans of monarchy on the continent, the uprisings showed the weaknesses of parliamentary government, but their ignominious collapse actually showed the growing strength of the parliamentary regime in England. The Jacobites left little permanent mark and soon passed into romantic legend. The Bubbles, meanwhile, immediately after the Peace of Utrecht, the problem of dealing with a large post-war government debt had to be faced in both England and France. Organized permanent public debt was new at the time. The possibilities and limitations of large-scale banking, paper money, and credit were not clearly seen. In France, there was much amazement at the way in which England and Holland, though smaller and less wealthy than France, enterprises in which to invest their savings. And promoters and organizers, anticipating a profit in new lines of business, were looking for capital with which to work. Out of this whole situation grew the South Sea Bubble in England and the Mississippi Bubble in France. Both bubbles broke in 1720, and both had important long-range effects. Critics of John Law ridiculed the Scottish financier's plan to pay off the French government's debt with profits from the sale of shares in the Mississippi Company. This early 18th century Dutch cartoon, for example, portrayed Law as a salesman of bogus shares and showed naive investors falling toward ruin in distant waters. Universal History Archive, Getty Images. A close tie between government finance and private enterprise was usual at the time, under mercantilist ideas of government guidance of trade. In England, for example, a good deal of the government debt was held by trading companies organized for that purpose. The government would charter a company, strengthen it with a monopoly in a particular kind of business, and then receive from the company, after the stockholders had bought up the shares, a large sum of cash as a loan. 549. Much of the British debt, contracted in the wars from 1689 to 1713, was held in this way by the Bank of England, founded in 1694, by the East India Company, reorganized in 1708 in such a way as to provide funds 296 for the government, and by the South Sea Company, founded in 1711. The bank enjoyed a legal monopoly over certain banking operations in London, the East India Company over trade with the East, the South Sea Company for exploiting the Asiento and other commercial privileges extorted from Spain. The companies were owned by private investors. Savings drawn from trade and agriculture, put into shares in these companies, became available both for economic reinvestment and for use by the government in defraying the costs of war. Ties between government and private enterprise. 550. In 1716, the Prince Regent of France, the Duke of Orleans, became interested in the ideas of a Scottish financier, John Law, reputedly because Law had a remarkable mathematical system for gambling at cards. Law founded a much-needed French central bank. In the next year, 1717, he organized a Compagnie d'Occident, popularly called the Mississippi Company, which obtained a monopoly of trade with Louisiana, where it founded New Orleans in 1718. This company, under Law's management, soon absorbed the French East India, China, Senegal, and African companies. It now enjoyed a legal monopoly of all French colonial trade. Seeing this trade as a means to solve France's financial problems, the regent authorized Law to assume the entire government debt. The Mississippi Company received from individuals their certificates of royal indebtedness, or bonds, and gave them shares of company stock in return. It proposed to pay dividends on these shares and to extinguish the debt from profits in the colonial trade and from a monopoly over the collection of all indirect taxes in France. The project carried with it a plan for drastic reform of the whole taxation system, to make taxes both more fair to the taxpayer and more lucrative to the government. Shares in the Mississippi Company were gobbled up by the public. There was a frenzy of speculation, a wild fear of not buying soon enough. Quotations rose to 18,000 livres a share, but the company rested only on unrealized projects. Shareholders began to fear for their money. They began to unload. The market broke sharply. Many found their life savings gone. Others lost ancestral estates on which they had borrowed in the hope of getting rich. Those, however, who had owned shares in the company before the rise and who had resisted the speculative fever lost nothing by the bursting of inflated prices and later enjoyed a gilt-edged commercial investment. John Law, South Sea Bubble, 5 and 51. Much the same thing happened in England. where many believed that Law was about to provide a panacea for France. The South Sea Company, outbidding the Bank of England, took over a large fraction of the public debt by receiving government bonds from their owners in return for shares of its stock. The size and speed of profits to be made in Spanish America were greatly exaggerated, and the market value of South Sea shares rose rapidly for a time, reaching £1,050 for a share of £100 par value. Other schemes abounded in the passion for easy money. Promoters organized mining and textile companies, as well as others of more fanciful or bolder design. A company to bring live fish to market in tanks, an insurance company to ensure female chastity, even a company for an undertaking which shall in due time be revealed. Shares in such enterprises were snatched at mounting prices. But in September 1720, the South Sea stockholders began to sell, doubting whether operations would pay dividends commensurate to £1,000 a share. They dragged down the whole unstable structure. As in France, many people found that their savings or their inheritances had disappeared in the financial implosion of a speculative bubble. Indignation in both countries was extreme. Both governments were implicated in the scandal. John Law fled to Brussels. The regent was discredited. He resigned in 1723, and French affairs were afterward conducted by Cardinal Fleury. In England, there was a change of ministers. Robert Walpole, a country gentleman of Whig persuasion who had 297 fin. The Bubble Act, 552 long sat in the Commons and who had warned against the South Sea scheme from the beginning, became the principal minister to George I. Britain recovered from the crisis more successfully than France. Law's Bank, a useful institution, was dissolved in the reaction against him, and France lacked an adequate banking and credit system during the rest of the century. French investors developed a morbid fear of paper securities and a marked preference for putting their savings into land. In England, the same fears were felt. Parliament passed the Bubble Act, forbidding all companies except those specifically chartered by the government to raise capital by the sale of stock. In both countries, the development of joint stock financing along the lines of the modern corporation was slowed down for over a century. Business enterprises continued to be typically owned by individuals and partnerships, which expanded by reinvestment of their own profits, and so had another reason to keep profits up and wages down. But in England, Walpole managed to save the South Sea Company, the East India Company, and the Bank, all of which were temporarily discredited in the eyes of the public. England continued to perfect its financial machinery. The credit of the two governments was also shaken by the bubbles. Much of the French war debt was repudiated in one way or another. Repudiation was in many cases morally justifiable, for many government creditors were unscrupulous war profiteers, but financially it was disastrous, for it discouraged honest people from lending their money to the state. Nor was much accomplished toward reform of the taxes. The nobles continued to evade taxes imposed on them by Louis XIV. John Law's plans for taxation evaporated with the rest of his project. And when in 1726 a finance minister tried to levy a 2% tax on all property, the vested interests, led by the Parliament of Paris, demolished this proposal also. Lacking an adequate revenue, facing opposition to every proposed tax increase, and repudiating its debts, the French monarchy had little credit. The conception of the public or national debt hardly developed in France in the 18th century. The debt was considered to be the king's debt, for which no one except a few ministers felt any responsibility. The Bourbon government, in fact, often borrowed through the church, the provincial estates, or the city of Paris, which lenders considered to be better financial risks than the king himself. The government was severely handicapped in its foreign policy and its wars. It could not fully tap the wealth of its own subjects or expanding global commerce. Credit and the national debt, 553. In England, none of the government debt was repudiated. Walpole managed to launch and sustain the system of the sinking fund, by which the government regularly set aside the wherewithal to pay interest and principal on its obligations. The credit of the British government became absolutely firm. The debt was considered a national debt, for which the British people themselves assumed the responsibility. parliamentary government made this development possible. In France, no one could tell what the king or his ministers might do, and hence the French were reluctant to trust them with their money. In England, the people who had the money could also, through Parliament, determine the policies of state, decide what the money should be spent for, and levy enough taxes to maintain confidence in the debt. England's social elites nevertheless shared the common French aversion to taxes that would most affect their own interests, and the landowners who controlled the British Parliament, like those who controlled the Parliament of Paris, resisted direct taxation. The British government therefore drew 2/3 or more of its revenues from indirect taxes paid by the mass of the population. Yet British landowners, 298 even dukes, did pay significant amounts of taxes. There were no exemptions by class or rank, as in France. All propertied interests had a stake in the government. The wealth of the country stood behind the national debt. The national credit seemed inexhaustible. This gave the British a decisive financial advantage in all their wars with France, from the founding of the Bank of England in 1694 to the fall of Napoleon 120 years later. And it was the political freedom and power of Parliament that gave Britain's government its economic strength. Fleury in France, Walpole in England. 554. Angry investors in London responded to the collapse of the South Sea Company in 1720 by seeking compensation for their lost money. As this illustration suggests, however, the unhappy shareholders could not recover their losses, and the South Sea Bubble destroyed the savings of English speculators in the same way that the Mississippi Bubble wiped out investments in France. The English banking system, however, recovered from this financial collapse more quickly than the French. Culture Club, Getty. Fleury was 73 years old when he took office in 1726 and 90 when he left it. He was thus not inclined to initiate programs for the distant future. Louis Iftit, as he came of age, proved to be indolent and selfish. Public affairs drifted, while France grew privately more wealthy, especially the commercial and bourgeois classes. Walpole likewise kept out of controversies. His motto was quieta non movere, let sleeping dogs lie. He sought to win over the Tory squires to the Hanoverian and Whig regime by keeping the land taxes low. This policy was successful, and Jacobitism quieted down. Walpole supported the bank, the trading companies, and the financial interests, and they in turn supported him. It was a time of political calm, in which the lower classes were quiet and the upper classes were not quarreling, and it was therefore a favorable time for the development of parliamentary institutions. 299. Walpole and Cabinet Government 555. Walpole has been called the first prime minister and the architect of cabinet government, a system in which the prime minister and the ministers who head the cabinet departments are also members of the legislative body. He saw to it, by careful rigging, that a majority in the Commons always supported him. He avoided issues on which his majority might be lost. He thus began to acknowledge the principle of cabinet responsibility to a majority in Parliament, which was to become an important characteristic of cabinet government. And by selecting colleagues who agreed with him and getting rid of those who did not, he advanced the idea of the cabinet as a body of ministers bound to each other and to the prime minister, obligated to follow the same policies and to stand or fall as a group. Thus, Parliament was not only a representative or deliberative body, but also one that developed an effective executive power, without which neither representative government nor any government could survive. To assure peace and quiet in domestic politics, the best means was to avoid raising taxes, and the best way to avoid taxes was to avoid war. Fleury and Walpole both tried to keep their countries at peace. They were not in the long run successful. Fleury was drawn into the War of the Polish Succession in 1733. Walpole kept England out of war until 1739. He always had a war party to contend with, and the most bellicose were those interested in the American trade, the slave trade, the sugar plantations, and the illicit sale of goods in the Spanish Empire. The British official figures show that while trade with Europe in the 18th century was always less in war than in peace, trade with America always increased during war, except, indeed, during the War of American Independence. In the 1730s, There were constant complaints of indignities suffered by Britons on the coasts of Spain's American colonies. The war party produced a Captain Jenkins who carried with him a small box containing a withered ear, which he said had been cut from his head by the outrageous Spaniards. Testifying in the House of Commons, where he commended his soul to God and his cause to his country, he stirred up a commotion that led to war. So in 1739, after 25 years of peace, England plunged with wild enthusiasm into the War of Jenkins's ear. "They are ringing the bells now," said Walpole. "They will soon be wringing their hands." The war soon merged into a wider conflict involving Europeans and others in all parts of the world. European wars could no longer be contained within Europe. The global economic and colonial systems that produced the expanding global trade also produced a series of global wars, in which the European powers extended their conflicts across all of the distant territories and seas they sought to control.